Morning guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. It is all going on ahead of the Qatar Grand Prix. McLaren explaining greater detail exactly why they were disqualified at the Las Vegas Grand Prix. Lando Norris believes that as a result of their discoveries, they will actually be faster this weekend, despite being forced to run the car higher than of course they did in Las Vegas. But also Oscar Piastri shutting down any suggestions that McLaren would sacrifice him to help Lando Norris in the championship this weekend. No team orders at McLaren, it's still all to play for. Very much enjoy to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. There was an awful lot to get into today, and we are going to start here because yesterday's video timing narrowly missed this. And when I saw it, I couldn't believe for a second that it was actually real, but it does make sense if we look at it from a couple of different angles. So if you guys haven't seen yet the news, the new team principal of Aston Martin will be, yes, Adrian Newey. So Andy Cowell was their former team principal. He's not been there that long. He was top engine boss at Mercedes for many a year. He stepped into a managerial role. He decided effectively that he would be a better fit for team principal than Mike Crack was. He got moved aside into kind of like trackside operation stuff. Andy Cowell took over the head position effectively, but Adrian Newey, he was brought in with equity as the managing technical partner, primarily to design the car, as we know, but also with absolutely huge influence and control over what happens in that organisation. Newey, as far as we understand, had a total veto over basically anyone in the managerial positions. And he was always going to design that managerial technical design team in the way that he felt fit best and in the level of control that him and Horner enjoyed in their heyday at Red Bull Racing. Now, over the last few days, the big rumour was, as soon as Andy Cowell was set to move on from team principal, it was initially a shock that there was reporting that Andy Cowell was getting sacked. He's still there at Aston Martin. He's in a different role. The good money says that Newey and Cowell had disagreements on the way that they wanted to handle things. And look, Newey is always going to get Lawrence Stroll's seal of approval in that discussion. So Cowell will move on to be the strategy officer. Effectively, he will liaise with Honda on the engine side, which is probably where he is best fit anyway, and have those relationships, manage those relationships, whereas Newey will be the team principal. Now, notably enough, it is worthy of saying, Cowell was the CEO and team principal. Adrian Newey is just the team principal. Now, that is an important distinction because the CEO candidacy is still potentially open. And when I did see this, once I processed that no, this is actually real, my first thought was, is this an interim for Christian Horner? Now, that may not be true. There is some reporting that's actually not how it is going to be, but it's worth discussing because Newey was calling the shots. There were disagreements with Andy Cowell. It felt like something had to change there from a team principal perspective. So look, either you put a dud effectively in charge as the technical team principal, whereas really it's Newey, or you just say it's Newey and he is making the decisions there. But also, Adrian Newey is a car designer, fundamentally. Does he want to be spending hours of his week managing the team from a staffing perspective, talking with sponsors? You know, probably not. So while he may be team principal in the sense that he is making the big decisions in terms of the way that everything will be structured, and as much as possible, you would presume, still actually designing the car, Aston Martin will not want to take him away from his drawing board anywhere more than they have to. And if Newey has to be there every single weekend, every single Grand Prix, to do a load of these duties, that's not exactly going to be optimal. Now look, if he comes up with a very strong technical development structure with individuals that he's very confident in, then maybe he doesn't have to do as much designing. He simply turns up once in a while, looks at what they've put together and says, okay, this, that and the other needs to change. This is an idea you guys should look at. And he will be effectively the maestro of coming up with the ideas that are then implemented. And after the 2026 car has been designed, he may not have to be there in his studio every single day. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that this is a somewhat more McLaren-style situation where Andrea Stella is the team principal, but a lot of the media at times and interviews and management of the team is actually done by Zach Brown. So there could be a dynamic here where Newey is technically the team principal, but somebody else takes charge of many of the more day-to-day related tasks, I think they are lining that up. But who that is an interesting question. Alonso talked about it and said that he thinks it makes sense for Newey to take on this role, given what was happening internally, presumably. And he says there's only one style with Adrian, and that is performance. So he's obviously optimistic they can do something. But Newey also said this: my wife over the last 3 to 4 months since I've joined the team complains that I'm in a design trance. What limiting processing power I have is all concentrated on the task at hand. So, does he want to be distracted by other duties? No. Next year he will become the team principal properly, but maybe not for too long. So there are still conversations around Horner. BBC Sports have sources at the team that say he will not be given the role. But Horner, we think, is available in May, roughly, to come back into Formula One next year. It could be a possibility that Horner comes in with ownership as the CEO. Newey is the team principal, but, basically doesn't do that much. Horner is effectively the CEO, team principal at that point. I don't know. It's very interesting because some are reading this as, Newey heard that Horner wanted to come and said, no, I'm doing it myself. There's another argument that says that actually they do get along better than they used to, and Horner and Newey would be open to working with each other again. But when I saw this, it was, I think, kind of important because there was a rumour that Horner might not get the job because they were going to give it to Andreas Seidel. And if they did that, then Horner's not joining. But with Newey there's still a very good possibility that Horner could find his way back into that type of dynamic. So, look, he probably will be designing the car. I don't think Alonso has too much to worry about, but a fascinating development. There was also this rumour that the Honda engine next year is going to be heavier than its rivals. An interesting rumour. Look, performance is still paramount. We know, though, that weight is going to be critical next year. And if the Honda engine is heavier than the Mercedes, again, this suggestion is that it's heavier, but, like heavier than what? Heavier than the Ferrari, than the Audi. Presumably they mean the Mercedes, right? But it's also very difficult to say at this stage, like, how much that would be true or how much that would really matter. But again, just something to mention. Media day today in Qatar, and lots of things were said. Ferrari, Hamilton last weekend said, I'm looking forward to this season ending. I'm not looking forward to the next one. But he was asked to comment on this and said, I think I'd be surprised if the other drivers are excited about next year at the end of a season because you don't have much energy left. You're looking forward to time with family and stuff, but that's in the heat of frustration. Often there's a lot of frustration at the end of races, particularly when they haven't gone well. I'm excited to see the team next year and continue to build on with them. So, strong words that Hamilton is still feeling good at the end of the season, but as we know, there's an awful lot going on behind the scenes at Ferrari. The key talking point, however, this weekend is who's going to win the championship. Lando Norris could win the championship this weekend. He was talking to the media and actually seems pretty relaxed, right? I do think this is a challenge for Norris mentally after what's happened back in Las Vegas, but, he still says to the media, yeah, there's pressure there, probably more than there has been, but his approach is still, imagine there's 10 races to go and you've got to win every single one. That is his approach, and if he achieves that this weekend, assuming there's no crazy drama in the sprint, he will be world champion. Now, Verstappen expects, though, this is the weekend. Obviously, he needs to win anyway, right, to gain points back, but he's expecting Qatar to be better for Red Bull than Abu Dhabi. Based on the last year or so, you would probably argue that that is going to be true. We'll see if that turns out to be true and how competitive McLaren really are, because they got disqualified last weekend. I mean, absolutely embarrassing, horrendous error to make in the context of the championship. Now, they went on to explain why exactly caused this, right? Because, yes, they ran the car too close to the ground, but it was really because they actually had some porpoising. Now, Lando mentions they saw porpoising in some of the practice sessions. Presumably, they didn't expect it to be as much of an issue in the race. It's not like it was incredibly bad like we saw in 2022, but this McLaren has never liked the Las Vegas track. This year, it seems that the porpoising was the phenomenon that it threw up. So If there was no porpoising, that ride height would have been fine. But because they were bouncing up and down, hitting the surface of the track. I think Oscar said in an interview as well that he knew driving the race that this is a bit marginal. Like, I'm on the ground here a lot. In the end, it wasn't even marginal. He was disqualified by, well, 0.24 of a millimetre, 0.26 of a millimetre, I think it was, which is, well, not a lot, obviously. It's maybe a human hair's width or slightly more than that, but it was significant compared to the level that is allowed, right? You're allowed to go from 10 millimeters to 9 millimeters. You go significantly beyond that, you're going to get disqualified, although the FIA have something to say about that. But the argument from Lando and McLaren is that actually they were slower in Vegas because of this issue than they would have been otherwise. Because as he says, it's not as simple as just lifting more and then it's better. Because it was caused by porpoising, if you lift, you actually can get even more porpoising. So that's why Andrea Sella described it as counterproductive to even manage the issue. So that's why he tried to really ease off at the ends, because that was the only way to do it. Like, you couldn't really manage it by going a little slower. You either just had to push or you had to go a lot slower to do any type of management. And Stella says that it was basically counterproductive to even try to manage it, which is, well, a pretty big indictment of how badly they got it wrong last weekend. The point is, though, that they're not expecting that to continue. And Lando says that it's obviously a much smoother surface in Qatar. There will be the cars hitting the track, right? There will be that level. But they are hoping, certainly based on, I mean, look, they've only got one practice session to figure it out, but they've got to hope that their car isn't going to be porpoising again. And look, even if it does go badly wrong after the sprint, they can make changes regardless. But the argument was put to Lando, look, are you going to have to massively raise the car in order to make sure what happened in Las Vegas doesn't repeat, and therefore you're going to lose performance? Now, that would be true to an extreme degree, but Lando's opinion is, look, no, if we raise it to a sensible level where it's, you know, we'll probably get away with it. I mean, they better get away with it for his sake and for Piastri's sake. We'll probably be quicker because we don't have to back off. And I think this is probably a fair assessment that Lando had to manage a lot, even when they came on the radio to Max and said, or GP came and said they've told Lando to come and get you. He mentioned in the same radio message, Lando's managing turn 5, turn 11, turn 17, which he was. He was doing a bit of lifting close. Max didn't have to worry about that, especially after the early VSC. It turned out there was really no fuel issues at all, so Max could push every corner, no problem, whereas Lando was not able to push because he had a lot of things to manage, and he probably feels that had they got it right on setup, not only would they not have been disqualified, but possibly he would have been able to compete or even beat Max last weekend. Now, the other drama about this, before we get into the internal team stuff, is whether this is fair. So there is a rule on the plank, and if you degrade it by more than a millimetre, to effectively prevent the teams running too close to the ground and bottoming out and all the potential safety consequences that could have. That's the rule. If it goes from 10 millimeters to 9 millimeters, any more than that, you get disqualified. Blanket rule. We've seen it now quite a few times. However, McLaren basically say, we gained no performance from this. We actually, if anything, lost performance, and it was marginal. Now, marginal is a matter of perspective. Is 0.01 millimeters marginal? Yes. Is 0.25 millimeters marginal? I mean, in terms of the objective reality, also still yes. But it's a pretty significant breach when every other team was perfectly fine. However, the FIA are interested in seeking alternative resolutions here, because McLaren have basically said we shouldn't have got penalised by disqualification because we didn't try to break the rules. That was done accidentally, it was done marginally, and we actually lost performance as a consequence of it. Now, of course, that final part is a matter of question, because while I actually think I agree with that assessment based on what Lando and Stella and everything have said, it's also impossible to know because we didn't see the Grand Prix run in both conditions. So McLaren can't argue with it. But the FIA have said the following. The FIA admitted that this lack of proportionality, because McLaren feel that for them to get double disqualified, given the minor wear that they had, in their opinion, was unfair. And I think it's a fair assessment to say that in the financial rules, if you have a minor breach, there's a certain consequence. If you have a major breach, there's another consequence. McLaren felt that just a blanket disqualification was unfair. The FIA agreed in part. They are therefore looking next year to address this lack of proportionality, to ensure that minor and accidental technical infringements with minimal or no performance benefits do not lead to disproportionate consequences. So effectively, McLaren would say, look, yeah, we breached the rules, but that should have been a 10-second penalty or something like that, rather than a race disqualification. Now, this is an argument that, of course, McLaren are entitled to make, but the FIA saying, actually, yeah, you make a point, is interesting, because many would say, well, hang on a second, do we not want these rules to be black and white? I don't really like this whole level of subjectivity. The teams know full well, if you go over the 9mm, you get disqualified. It simply is what it is. And yeah, does it feel a bit unfair in some situations? Sure. But also, Hamilton's DRS flap, or whatever it was, a DRS gap, back in 2021 was, what, a millimetre or maybe less than that, greater than it should have been. It's happened recently to Williams as well. That's just a straight up disqualification. Now, of course, in that case, there is an objective performance advantage from it. In this case, that's not so true. So I do see the logic in this debate, but I do tend to side with what most people believe, which is, hang on, we shouldn't be doing grey area stuff here. It should be black or white. You either get disqualified or you don't based on these rules. And every other team has generally been okay with it, right? But I do see the opinions on either side of this debate. Probably the most interesting thing that was said today was by Oscar Piastri. Just before we get there, Racing News 365 say that they've got a new setup and the asphalt is very smooth, but it will be a mandatory two-stop race. And as I mentioned the other day, that means there will be no management, there will be no real lift and coast for tyre degradation reasons anyway. They will be pushing to the maximum, and as a result, well, they will need to make sure their car is not sparking all that much. The other question, though, that was raised was, what do you do in the championship? Lando is at 390 points, Max is at 366, Oscar's at 366 as well. Now, if last weekend went differently, then potentially after the sprints, Lando could have been ahead of Oscar by a margin that couldn't be caught up effectively. At that point, the conversation would shift. But there is a debate to say, Piastri is not fallen out of contention. He's still in it, as we know mathematically, but realistically, he doesn't look like McLaren's best chance as it stands, whereas Max is closing in substantially. So, is there a conversation about team orders? Should McLaren say, okay, Oscar, you know, you tried, but Lando's now our man, right? Lando's been our number one for a little while, and we're going to back him to the hilt, especially after the disqualification, as we saw in Vegas, which just made things more challenging for him. They could say to Oscar, they could try to say to Oscar, okay, we need you to give Lando a tow in this qualifying session, or we need you in, especially the Grand Prix situation, to maybe go long, hold up Max, go long, hold up somebody else in the field so that Lando still holds solid position if he, gets a slow stop or something, right? And that may still happen in Abu Dhabi. I wouldn't rule it out. But for now, that's not the case. Piastri says, we had a very brief discussion on it about helping Norris for the title. The answer is no. I'm still on equal points with Max. I've got a decent shot of winning it if things go my way. That is how we will play it. So it's interesting, and I think the major debate here really is that they talked about it, right? So McLaren, they were never going to do this. McLaren even said earlier in the season that they will not back a driver until it is mathematically impossible for the other to win. Now, of course, it's worth saying that after this weekend, it's very plausible that Lando does pull ahead of Oscar by another couple of points, at which case for Abu Dhabi, if Oscar is 26 points behind Lando, he's currently 24, then they may need to do that, assuming Max wins and stays in the fight and closes the gap to Lando to some degree. But I think the major debate really was that they talked about it. They said to Oscar, at least they mentioned to Oscar about whether they would do this. It's interesting, like, the way that Oscar said it, because he said, we had a discussion about it. The answer is no. That sounds like that McLaren kind of maybe asked him and he said no. But I'm not sure that's exactly what that implies. I think that's one way to read it. I think there's another way to read it that says, as a team, like, Oscar certainly didn't suggest it, right? I think we can make that very clear. So somebody suggested it, and it wasn't Oscar. They then discussed it as a team. I don't imagine McLaren were like trying to push Oscar to be like, oh, Oscar, you should really help Lando. I don't imagine they would be doing that. Of course, it's difficult to say. It's not like Mark Webber proposed the idea, is it? So, yeah, they've said no. It's not an unreasonable way to read this, that they asked him to and Oscar said no, but I don't imagine they asked him to, even if they did, with particular severity, because it wasn't long ago that they said that they would not do any sort of favoritism until the title is impossible for one of their drivers. But if he does come, let's say Oscar ends up third this weekend, Lando's second even, and nothing crazy happens in the sprints, then Oscar will be mathematically out of it into Abu Dhabi, at which point all of those discussions then do come into play. So intrigued to your thoughts on the comments. The final thing, I guess, really from Lando, he says, yeah, I'm still feeling relaxed. I felt relaxed when I was behind. I still feel the same today. Whether that's going to be the case when we get into the car this weekend, that is another question. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Practice tomorrow, the sprint qualifying tomorrow, sprint on Saturday. Yeah, we're in for quite a weekend. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.